Always trust.
The UN Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, established to support Palestinian refugees, says it's become the target of an aggressive campaign by the Israeli government, accusing it of harbouring ties to Hamas that it denies. This comes as Palestinians suffer a humanitarian crisis in Gaza, where more than 250 of UNRWA's staff have been killed since the start of Israel's war, and some of its buildings and infrastructure damaged or destroyed. While aid supplied by the agency remains a lifeline for millions of Palestinians, Israel's attempts to delegitimize it have led to critical funding being frozen by Western countries, leaving its future and the lives of those it serves in jeopardy. In the face of mounting political and physical attacks, can UNRWA continue to fulfill its mandate? Philippe Lazzarini, Commissioner General of UNRWA, talks to Al Jazeera. Philippe Lazzarini, Commissioner General of UNRWA, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera. Now, I last spoke to you almost exactly a year ago, and then we said how bad the situation was in Gaza, but then the death toll stood at 17,500. Now it's almost 45,000. We said a year ago that it was so bad and we didn't think it could get much worse. I mean, 45,000, that's a staggering 10,000 or so people killed for every one of the 14 months of the year. It has got so much worse.
Yes, it's 45,000, among them 70% of children and women.
And the figures are probably an undercount, aren't they?
And these figures certainly do not take into consideration the people who are under the rubble, and do not take into consideration the excess mortality in the Gaza Strip. So the 45,000 are the people who have been recorded in various health facilities, hospitals, by the Ministry of Health in the Gaza Strip.
And tell us about the conditions for people in Gaza.
I think we are getting out of war to try to describe the situation in Gaza. By any account, this has been a war of all the superlative. If you look at the number of people who have been killed, we just mentioned the level of destruction in the Gaza Strip, the number of times people have been forced to be displaced, the fact that there is absolutely no safe place, the fact that the people are living in subhuman living condition. My colleagues, when they come back, they basically describe a post-apocalyptic environment, and people are just living among garbages, sewage water in the rubble, and are struggling because they are confronted on a daily basis with death, hunger, and disease.
You haven't been to Gaza for a long time because Israel will not let you go to Gaza. We'll get to the Israeli restrictions on UNRWA in a minute, but given what you've seen on your previous trips, and I know you know this place very, very well, trying to imagine what it must be like now, given how bad it was when you were there last.
It's, I mean, the story, there are so many untold stories. I had this week, for example, one of my staff counselor who went to Gaza for 4 weeks, and she came back. She has talked to 2,000 of our staff, trying to get a sense of their living condition. And people were telling her how they are trying to survive, for example, in eating animal fodder, because there is absolutely nothing else. All the stories of fathers who feel having lost completely their dignity because they cannot protect their children and their families. Stories where half of families have been killed on the airstrike, and the father or the mother trying to bring the bodies into plastic bags, but not knowing which part of the body belongs to whom, and how this is deeply, deeply traumatic for the people. I think we have no idea on how this population has been pushed down. At the beginning of the war, you might recall that we heard a number of Israeli politicians saying that we will treat Gazan like a human animal, and when you go to Gaza, they say, but animals are much better treated than what we are right now. They have lost, we push them to lose what remains, which is the human dignity.
And if you look at all of the Gaza Strip, nowhere is safe, as the UN has been saying repeatedly, but I want to focus on the northern part of the Gaza Strip, because in addition to everything else, that seems to be under a total Israeli siege now for well over 50 days. Do you even know what the conditions are like there? Because
no.
you can't get in.
We cannot get in. We have very little information. We got a few weeks ago messages of alarm from our staff being stuck in this siege in the north and basically telling us, come now because we are waiting for death. Otherwise, the situation is desperate. People are put under pressure to leave the north of the northern part of Gaza.
So you think it's a deliberate tactic to clear that area? That is without doubt, is it, from what we're seeing?
Having such a tight siege imposed on tens of thousands of people in the north of Gaza certainly aim at moving these people further down.
Now, we've talked before about the risk of famine and the way the humanitarian community works and the UN works. There's this thing called the IPC, the Integrated Phase Classification System, and you have to be absolutely sure that something is a famine. Are we now at famine stage?
We are at famine stage for hundreds of thousands of people in Gaza. Basically, the IPC is describing that people are living in catastrophic living condition, which means that at any time they can start to die because of malnutrition. So yes, we have pockets, and certainly the people living on the tight siege in North Gaza, but we see also hunger deepening and spreading, being rampant across the entire Gaza Strip.
When we talked about northern Gaza and people being pushed out of northern Gaza, there are persistent suggestions that Israel is carrying out these operations to create buffer zones and maybe even future Israeli settlements, resettling parts of the Gaza Strip. Is this something on the ground the UN has to be vigilant about and try and find a way to prepare for? And is there anything you can do?
For the time being, we do not have evidence about such a policy or future policy, but we keep hearing this, we keep hearing that this is being suggested, and obviously the position of the UN and the international community is that there should not be cleansing of population, movement of population, forcing them to go to the south to use after that part of the territories for different purposes for the State of Israel.
I know you are not a military man, you are very much a humanitarian, but you know Gaza very, very well indeed. I think one of your very first jobs was in Gaza. When you look at what's going on at the moment, can you see what Israel is trying to achieve with its military operation? Because most of the leaders of Hamas, military commanders, are already dead. To me, yes, they want to get those that were taken captive by Hamas out, but they've had options to do that. There have been options on the table. There's been a ceasefire proposal that has been actually passed by the UN Security Council back in June. Can you see any reason for these actions other than death and destruction and carnage for the Palestinian people being deliberately wrought by Israel?
Well, the fact on the ground makes Gaza not a land anymore for the future of the Palestinians. Have many times said also Gaza is no land for the children, or Palestinian children. The more this war is continuing, the more people are put in the condition in which they are living in today, the more the destruction continue in the Gaza Strip. Soon there will be absolutely nothing to reconstruct. So the real question is, will there be a real future for the people in Gaza? Now, this is a pessimistic part, but we still believe that a ceasefire should be possible hostages be released, that humanitarian assistance goes into Gaza, and that finally there is a genuine political process which could lead to a pathway for a two-state solution for empowered Palestinian institution. In fact, the situation can go either way.
When we spoke a year ago on the issue of international law, you and all UN officials rightly said this is for the courts to decide. They must decide. But since then, we've had the International Court of Justice, the top court in the UN system, part of the United Nations, saying that Israel must stop its military operations and let the aid in. We have the International Criminal Court that's come up with arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, and his former defense minister. And yet, nothing has changed, nothing has happened, despite the courts pronouncing on this. Are you frustrated?
Well, deeply frustrated. It's a defiance of the international rule-based order, there is no doubt. A defiance vis-à-vis the UN Charter, a defiance vis-à-vis international humanitarian law, and a defiance vis-à-vis the ruling of the International Court of Justice. What we are confronted with and observing today is a total crisis of impunity. Basically, this is, undermining the relevancy of the Geneva Convention.
And undermining potentially international law, tearing up principles that took so many decades to be put in place. Let me ask you about the displacement of people, because it's not just people who've been moved from their homes. Most Gazans have been moved multiple times and are living day to day not knowing where they're going to be. Is there any way the UN can help people now?
This is quite unique in the world. People have no safe place to go. They do not have even a border to cross. And in the Gaza Strip, we have seen over the last 14 months, if they have been moved like pinballs, it's because there is absolutely no safe place in Gaza. Many times they were said, go in this area, this will be a safe place. But days after, the safe place was not a safe place anymore. And people were losing relatives, losing belonging, and so on. So indeed, we feel deeply frustrated and powerless vis-à-vis a situation where protection of civilians has almost lost its meaning.
And one of those places that Israel repeatedly said was a safe place was down in the very south of the Gaza Strip by the sea Mawasi. And yet we've seen there really dreadful conditions with the weather and with the sea coming in on people's tents, but also people, as you say, being bombed there. At one point, a 2,000-pound bomb was dropped on a tented encampment. It's quite amazing.
It is, and we keep saying there will be no safe zone in Gaza Strip as long as the war is conducted the way it is conducted. And indeed, the civilians are the one paying the heavy price. And it comes to no surprise that we have situations like the one you just described in Mawasi, unfortunately.
Now let's talk about the aid and getting the aid into Gaza, because repeatedly Israel says it's the UN's fault, it's the UN bureaucracy and whatever that's not letting the aid in. Explain to us the current situation, because as I understand it, you are not currently bringing aid in, is that right?
We haven't brought aid for the last 2 weeks plus, basically. The last time we have brought aid in, the convoys were completely looted by organized crime or organized families in the Gaza Strip. And this is a consequence of the total breakdown of law and order and of the anarchy now prevailing in the Gaza Strip. So it has become extraordinarily difficult to operate within the Gaza Strip. So we have two problems. The first is to bring the aid into the Gaza Strip, but once it is into the Gaza Strip nearby a given crossing, to move the aid to the warehouses and to the people in need. And in the absence of a rule of law, in the absence of security, in the absence of police manning, or guarantees coming from Israel, it is impossible to move around without this kind of incident. And that's the reason why I took the decision a week ago to announce that as far as we're concerned, we are not in a position anymore to bring convoys into Gaza.
And just to be clear, though, you are saying the aid is being attacked on the Gaza side. There are some, I'm sure, in Israel who will pick up on your words and say, well, it's all the fault of the Palestinians, that they're attacking their own aid. But this is because of the conditions created after 14 months, I guess, and the fact that there used to be police who could have escorted that if necessary, and they have been bombed. And I think under international law, it's Israel that has the responsibility because they are the occupying power.
Absolutely. We operated until maybe 6 months ago with local police providing the protection to the convoys. One by one, they all have been killed, so we have absolutely no police. And if you are in a situation where the aid entering into Gaza represent maybe 5% of the total need of the population, and resources are completely depleted, and you do not have any law and order, that's exactly what you will get at the end is total anarchy. And today the humanitarian workers are operating in this kind of environment, and this is an additional reason why today Gaza is the most dangerous place for an humanitarian worker to operate. We are not only exposed to the airstrike, where we had hundreds of people being killed, but today we are also exposed to this situation of anarchy.
Over the last 14 months, we've seen hospitals, doctors, and medical staff consistently targeted. Now, as you said, nowhere is safe in Gaza, but there seems to be a focus on these people. We had the UN's Independent International Commission of Inquiry concluding that there was a concerted policy by Israel to destroy the healthcare system, I quote, committing war crimes and crimes against humanity of extermination with relentless and deliberate attacks on medical personnel and facilities. Now, you don't know what Israel's orders are, but given how many times healthcare facilities have been targeted, can you come to any other conclusion than that?
Well, certainly not. I mean, the international humanitarian law has been blatantly disregarded and constantly since the beginning of the war. And you are talking right now about the health workers, but we have the same with the humanitarian workers. You have the same with the UNRWA staff member. More than 250 of our staff have been killed since the beginning of the war. And look at the journalists also. It's one of the worst places in the world to operate. You have more than 150 local journalists who have done an extraordinary work, who also have been killed in the Gaza Strip. So even if we cannot yet demonstrate that there is a deliberate intent, at least there haven't been anything put in place to protect these workers.
And yet so much of the world is not taking notice. You would think they would at least take notice of the children that are being killed. Two statistics that I read recently really shocked me. Gaza now has the highest number of child amputees in the world per capita, and many of them had their limbs cut off without anesthesia. And more than 17,000, I think this is correct, Palestinian children are unaccompanied or separated from their families. I mean, how do you explain this and make people notice this?
You cannot explain it, because if we explain it and accept it, that would also mean that collectively we are losing our sense of humanity. Can you imagine that how the amputees in the Gaza Strip, where we have anyway the highest number per capita in the world, that they are children and that they have been operated without anesthesia, and without anesthesia only because you have policies which prevent anesthetic material to come into the Gaza Strip. How cruel is this?
Now, there have been allegations made against UNRWA, and we need to look at those, of UNRWA staff being involved in the October the 7th attacks. The UN carried out, as I understand it, 2 different investigations. In the end, I think 9 staff members, correct me if I'm wrong, were fired, although many of the allegations were not proven. But this had a devastating effect on your funding. Many countries cut their funding, and as I understand it, the US funding is still frozen. Do you think these allegations were used, deliberately weaponized, to blacken the name of your agency?
There is no doubt about this. This allegation and other allegation of collusion or infiltration with Hamas.
Well, they said 10% of your staff had links with Hamas.
Have been used to weaponize and to label the agency as a terrorist organization to justify, in fact, the call from Israel to dismantle the agency, to justify the 2 Knesset bill which have just been adopted. And behind this, there is a political objective, which is to strip the Palestinians from the refugee status and to unilaterally modify the parameter for a future peace in the region. There is a belief that if UNRWA disappear, the question of the Palestinian refugees will also disappear. But obviously it is false, because even if the agency would end its activities, the Palestinian refugee status would remain.
Okay, let's break that all down because it's quite complicated. The Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament, they voted on the 28th of October to ban your activities, not just inside Israel, but in Gaza and East Jerusalem and the occupied West Bank, is my understanding. On that, what do you do now about that?
Our first call to all the member states having an influence is to convince Israel not to implement these laws. These laws are supposed to be implemented as from January 30. And after that, I believe we have to safeguard and insulate the mandate of an agency like UNRWA within a political framework. What does it mean? That means that if there is really a genuine political process leading to a 2-state solution, or at least an irreversible pathway, during this transition, UNRWA can provide education to the hundreds of thousands of girls and boys currently living in the rubble, being deeply traumatized, bringing them back in a learning environment. We can continue to provide the primary health care to the entire population in Gaza, and at the same time building the capacity of a future empowered Palestinian institution of a Palestinian state. And I believe that an agency like ours, being primarily a provider of public services, can play a positive role in any transition leading from the ceasefire to the day after.
And this ban would not just affect Gaza. We haven't talked at all about the West Bank. It would affect your activities in the West Bank, would it not, where Israeli killing and aggression has also got so much worse since we last met a year ago?
The ban would impact occupied East Jerusalem, would impact the West Bank, and would also impact the Gaza Strip. In fact, it would impact the entire occupied Palestinian territories.
Is there anything that could replace UNRWA if they go ahead with this? Are there other UN agencies, the World Food Programme, UNHCR, the activities could be done in a rebranded way? Is that a possibility or not?
A Palestinian state can replace UNRWA. The solution for UNRWA to disappear is a genuine, lasting political solution. Meanwhile, of course, some UN agencies or international organizations can increase their humanitarian response to the crisis in Gaza, but there is none of them which has the ability or which was geared to provide education at the primary, secondary level to hundreds of thousands of girls and boys. Only in the occupied Palestinian territories, we have more than 350,000 girls and boys in our school. We have 17,000 staff. There is no way that another UN agency or international organization can take over these activities because they do not have the expertise. So the solution to have a viable, lasting alternative is a state, functioning public administration. Now, if UNRWA has to leave and there is no alternative, the responsibility will be the one of the occupying power, being the state of Israel. And Israel will have to take the responsibility to provide these services to the population.
You have the end of January, that is the deadline. Also, towards the end of January, you have a new administration in Washington, D.C., and that does not look at all favourable to UNRWA when you look at some of the cabinet appointees from President Trump. For example, Elise Stefanik, who is slated to be the UN ambassador under a Trump administration, has described UNRWA as a terrorist front.
You know, I believe we will have to engage with a new administration. Once the administration is in place, the new administration is also talking about promoting peace and security in the region, promoting further normalization. And I think in the past we have seen that normalization has not taken into consideration the Palestinian question. I really hope that this time, when we talk about further deepening the normalization in the region, it will also address the Palestinian question. And if it addresses the Palestinian question, that might also provide a role to UNRWA to make sure that the Palestinian solution be a lasting one in the future.
You talk about addressing the Palestinian question, but as you were saying a moment ago, there are 6 million Palestinian refugees registered with UNRWA, and a lot of them are not in the occupied West Bank, occupied East Jerusalem and Gaza. They're in other countries. You operate in Syria, Lebanon and Jordan. Do you think that's the real reason to destroy UNRWA, to make it, try and find a way that those people never have a right to return?
Well, clearly, the main objective is to strip the Palestinians from the refugee status, and the objective is that by doing this, the Palestinian refugee issue has been addressed. But again, even if UNRWA ends its services, the status will remain. The status is conferred to the Palestinian through a different General Assembly resolution than the resolution which has created the agency.
Finally, Commissioner General, you might, depending on how things play out in the coming weeks and months, end up as the last Commissioner General of UNRWA. What would that mean to you, and what would it mean for Palestinians?
When I started, I said I dreamed to be the last commissioner for UNRWA, but at that time I had in mind a different prospect, a genuine political process, and finally the dream of self-determination of the Palestinian being realized. Now, if the end of an agency like UNRWA would come at the end of January, this would be very bad news for the Palestinian, who would feel that the international community is definitely turning its back to their plight.
Philippe Lazzarini, Commissioner General of UNRWA, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you.